The heat is rising in this love triangle of will they or won't they? No, I'm not talking about the on screen romance and heated rivalry. We're talking about the ongoing saga of the potential Warner Brothers sale to either Paramount or Netflix. Plus, we noted that the impacts from tariffs didn't hit ad growth as heavily as expected last year, but now advertisers are faced with still more uncertainty after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that one vehicle used by the current administration to deploy tariffs wouldn't cut it. Let's dig in. You're listening to the Media Intelligence Podcast from WPP Media. I'm Kate Scott Dawkins with Jeff Foster and Nidhi Shah from the Business Intelligence team. And each week we unpack the biggest stories in media and marketing and why they matter for brands. So I feel like we have to start now, Paramount and Warner Brothers, and we'll circle back to a couple of the European broadcasters and TV media companies that reported as well. We had both Paramount and Warner Brothers reporting earnings this week. Of course, neither of them said anything about the potential mergers or acquisitions. So we're sort of left to draw our own conclusions there. But we can talk about how performance looked. Let's start with Paramount, Jeff.
Yeah, sure. So for Paramount, in their fourth quarter, total revenue of the successor company, as they're calling it, was up 2% year over year. A couple interesting things to note: the DTC revenue was up 10% year over year, driven by a 17% increase in Paramount Plus year over year. And of course, we should just preface this by saying reporting is slightly changed now with Paramount. So now we get a little bit more detail on the DTC side as far as advertising goes, but everything is lumped into one DTC type of business segment with Paramount Plus, Pluto, and BET Plus.
Yeah, so it implies Pluto did not have a great quarter. They talked a little bit about that in the call, saying it had more to do with monetization rather than viewing growth. But that implies sort of either that Pluto can't compete as well, maybe with more ad-supported streaming supply coming online on offer to advertisers. So, the viewing is up, but either maybe they aren't filling the ad slots as well, or they aren't getting the prices they once did for those ad slots. So that's going to be an interesting question that I think will particularly be following, and I assume investors will as well. I will note this kind of matches what we heard from Fox as well, not as drastically maybe, but where to-be viewing time grew 27%, with revenue growing just 19%.
Yeah, exactly. Because it was interesting that they did note that in the fourth quarter, Pluto declined 16% year over year, as you mentioned, primarily due to monetization headwinds. Having my old TV hat on, does that mean, right, that they're not getting the prices that they were hoping for? Maybe an increase in ad load is on the way, or some combination of all of this. Clearly, when they were talking about like the content and they want to build out DTC as a top priority of next year, you could see where Warner Brothers Discovery would fit into this as far as the content side goes. But I think that's going to be, just like you said, a really an area that's going to get a lot of scrutiny from investors and how this will play out, because they definitely have a lot of confidence in Pluto. When listening to the call. So it seems like it's going to be a big focus for them in the upcoming year.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of premium content, though, that's coming with that would come potentially with the studios and streaming business is not the kind of stuff they're necessarily going to put on. I mean, maybe back catalog stuff.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe some of the real deep back catalog stuff from Warner Brothers Studios on the TV side, when you have these old shows from the 60s and 70s that could, live on Pluto quite well.
Yep. All right. Advertising. Total advertising.
So let's see, total advertising was down 11% in 2025 for the full year to $9.1 billion. That was be down from about $10.3 billion in 2024. So if this all holds, we're still waiting for some more earnings to come in, but it would make Paramount about the 15th largest ad seller, down from 11. Now, of course, there was political last year.
Yeah.
And we're waiting to see where a couple of the other, companies land. But, it's something interesting we'll keep an eye out on.
Yeah, they have a big news property, obviously, with CNN and the broadcast stations. They own quite a few.
Right.
I think what they say on the call, 28 or something, or maybe across,
Owned and operated stations across the U.S.
Yeah, so that's definitely comes with a hefty political bonus. So they should see some more of that this year as well.
Exactly.
But yeah, it's not great. in terms of rankings. And we're waiting mostly for a lot of the Chinese-based ad sellers to come in. We don't get a lot of those results until I think 10 cents like March 18th. We've been saying this in the team. It feels like a really long, drawn out first earnings season of the year. So just waiting until we have all of those media owners in so we can finalize our yearly totals.
We should do a prediction market bet to see where Paramount will end up at, when all the numbers come in.
Actually, they just booted 2 people off of, what was it, Kalshi
Yeah.
for insider trading. So
It's
I'm gonna say we should not just do that.
Good point.
Yeah.
And I will say one other thing that was interesting to note that Paramount Plus subscribers were up 1 million quarter over quarter. So the end of the year at 78.9 million subscribers.
All right. And the linear business, TV, media, also in decline, which is what we would have predicted and have predicted across this year, next year for the category as a total.
Yeah, the TV media for full year advertising was 7.1 billion in 2025 versus 8.2 billion in 2024. Yeah, which we've expected and which we're seeing in all of our models. So I wouldn't say there was too big of a surprise there.
Yeah. The big impact from political, as you said, too.
Political.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also the loss of the Big Ten championship game, which is always a big event. That was on Fox this past year, and CBS had it the previous year.
Okay. They spent a long time in the upfront section talking about like UFC and how important that whole owning
Yeah.
that space was to them, which, okay, it's not what I watch, so I guess. But yeah, they're also asked about the upcoming NFL rights renewal, which we've talked about on this podcast before. So definitely sports is going to be the theme throughout today's podcast as we talk about how important that is to the fortunes of these TV media companies.
Yeah, I would say it is interesting now that the NFL renewal rights has definitely been a theme across all earnings for the major rights holders. It did come up on the Paramount one. It was interesting that the way they positioned it of the power of their local stations of those
Mm.
28 O and O's that provides a lot of reach for the NFL, a lot of value. They didn't necessarily say versus a streamer, but it was implied that the local has a lot of value, which we've heard on the Comcast earnings as well about the NFL renewal, and we heard on Fox as well for NFL renewal, and on Disney for NFL. So definitely is picking up a lot of attention, maybe a little bit sooner than some of the media owners had expected. But it's going to be very interesting to see how this all plays out. I think we'll know sooner than later.
Yeah, they also tried to rely on like the longevity of that relationship, and we were the first partner and all kinds of things. But we'll see. Things change. So
Yes.
the other side of that was Warner Brothers Discovery, which reported just this morning. I mean, similar kind of fortunes, right? Streaming is doing well. Linear networks are not as much. And we saw the impact of sports there too.
Yeah, a lot of commentary on the loss of the NBA and the impact that was having across both the linear and on the streaming side as well. So that was definitely a big theme. I think it was interesting for advertising revenue for the full year was 7.3 billion. So that was down 11% in constant currency. Still on track. Again, we'll see where it all lands, but still on track to be the 16th largest ad seller in our model.
Yeah. I mean, this is just the replacement, that's maybe a bit tough, but as we've gone through the last couple of decades, and we talked about this last week, I think, is media companies competing for those advertising dollars with services companies that are supplying a broad array of things for consumers, whether that's shopping alongside content and advertising or productivity and utilities alongside content and advertising. So it's going to be interesting, I think, to see where they end up. Is it back sort of in the role of content producers
Mhm.
rather than the end relationship holder, or Disney, Netflix, and Comcast on a strategy of building out experiences that enable you to use that IP and also have business and reasons for consumer relationships and contact that are not strictly tied to media. And in that sense, where does that leave a Warner Brothers, a Paramount that don't have those same kinds of properties at the moment?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because you think obviously like a Disney on their experiences that has that nice part of the business, Comcast as well with the theme parks. But
Yep.
when you look at a Paramount and especially a a Warner Brothers Discovery, depending on where that ends up, yeah, you definitely don't have those other touch points across the ecosystem.
I'm fascinated to see where the Netflix sort of experience houses, I don't remember what they're calling them, go. I mean, I've been fortunate enough to experience what that can kind of look and feel like, say, at their Cannes, um, you know, installation. So, but I'm interested to see how consumers view that or how popular they are, or does it have the same effect as a much bigger, grander, more expensive kind of experience like a Universal Parks or a Disney Parks.
Exactly, and it raises, another issue if you're like a Netflix, do you license out a Stranger Things type of experience, for example, to a Universal Studios, or do you try to go find a partner and, sort of create your own theme park type of version or experiences or build out the experiences? So, yeah, it's it's gonna be some very interesting, decisions on the horizon.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot more on linear networks and streaming. Why don't you give us just a couple more of the key
Yeah,
points?
I think for streaming, it was, pretty interesting for Warner Brothers Discovery. Total revenue for the full year was, 9.4 billion, so up 5% in constant currency. Streaming ad revenue for the full year up 20% on a constant currency basis to just over $1 billion. Global streaming subscribers were 131.6 million, an increase of 3.5 million globally. Of course, they've been entering more markets. There will be entering more markets in 2026. Makes you put your hat on together what a combined Netflix, Warner Brothers streaming would look like. Obviously, there could be some overlap, so you can't just simply add the two numbers to think about what it could look like. I guess you could. That's one way to do it, but kind of give you an idea of what the scale and the combined, membership subscriber base would look like, which is interesting.
Yeah, the international expansion, I did note they spent a lot of time talking about that, how they'd gone into Germany and Italy. They're planning to next go into
You
the
know,
UK and
it,
Ireland. Those are big markets for streaming, the UK and Germany in particular. Nitty, you talk about this a lot when we're doing client presentations in terms of having more sort of advanced or penetrated streaming TV markets. They were pointing at a potentially close to 10 million additional subscribers, I thought, in my listening in the current quarter to end Q1. So that's a substantial amount of growth.
yeah, it sure is, and it was interesting too that the global streaming ARPU decreased 9% to $6.80. So, yeah, I guess with that expansion, you might see some lower pricing in different markets, but I think that's going to put, even more pressure on the advertising business to, try to get higher CPMs, higher rates, especially on a global scale.
Well, let's stick with Europe then. And Nidhi, why don't we talk through the European media players that reported this week?
Yeah, we're seeing similar trends really. Linear TV declining, streaming not offsetting these declines, streaming still a very small portion of that total revenue, particularly for the European broadcasters. We had Atresmedia and TF1 report so far. Atresmedia reported that audiovisual content advertising revenue declined by 6.2% in the full year of 2025. TF1 reported around 4.3% total advertising revenue decline in 2025. So really just there's a lot of focus in 2026, I think. Someone like Atlas Media is pursuing broad diversification, really, as we're seeing these kind of linear TV declines. They've obviously had their planned integration of Clear Channel Spain and, really trying to reduce that reliance on just linear TV. And just goes to the fact that how these media owners are thinking about that broader spectrum beyond TV and being able to touch consumers at multiple different points. Whereas, someone like TFI is looking at opening its ad platform to SMEs this year. Its partnership with Netflix will, help, reach hopefully new audience as well. And they mentioned about really monetizing their streaming platform. So really that ad load increasing by 15% over the year to just over 5 minutes per the hour. Their target is to reach around 6 minutes midterm. So, it'll be interesting to see how much of these initiatives will support overall kind of advertising growth for these media owners, whether that diversification or that SMB growth will be enough to offset linear TV declines over the next multiple years, and how fast we can see some of those effects coming into play. I think it's
How
really
fast
interesting.
maybe we get to sort of the old linear ad load of 12 minutes an hour, and then what happened? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's just interesting as well, right? Like one of the things you guys mentioned about sports, it's also quite relevant in Europe. We've seen broadcasters where there's quarters, where there are sports, and that really providing that boost in advertising revenue. So, TF1 not having the World Cup this year, probably likely to benefit less from advertising revenue growth compared to its competitors, such as M6, who does have the World Cup rights. So for all the games. So really interesting trends we're seeing, and some of that consolidation is naturally happening within the sector, not just in Europe, but also other regions.
I mean, it does make you wonder what would it look like if the MC's TF1 merger had been allowed a couple years ago, whether that would have given them the scale to compete a little bit better with some of these international and digital first players. But yeah, I mean, hindsight, right?
Yeah, fascinating.
What else we have? Let's finish off on the media owners, and then looks like Mercado Libre reported this week as well. But let's go to TelevisaUnivision.
Yeah, so that was really interesting when they reported earlier in the week, and it was almost a tale of two different markets when listening or reading the press release. And I'm looking through the commentary from management and the questions. U.S. advertising revenue declined 9% to 7.1 billion, or 6% excluding political advertising. A lot of highlighting, talking about how their streaming service VIX was growing, but not enough to quite offset linear declines. They did talk a lot about premium demand for advertising around events, such as like the Latin Grammys, the big music type of events seems to do very well for them, which, fits into what we've been seeing in our analysis, how these big events, it's obviously sports included, but other big events, whether it's award shows or a big, music type of show, do still, get rather large audiences and big reach. So interesting to hear that. The other big commentary in the U.S. was a lot of talk around, trying to better optimize and to capture more political spending.
Yeah.
As we've said, and as our model shows, this is going to be a huge year, probably a near record for political spending, especially on the midterms, and might even be close to what a presidential election is. We're seeing about $12.3 billion. So that did come up a lot in the Q&A section about how they can better capture those dollars.
Yeah, awfully spiky for, I mean, between the on-off cycle of elections and then the on-off cycle of sports. Actually, I would not want to manage a television company myself.
It's hard to smooth out those cycles. I
Yeah,
guess, you have an Olympics every 2 years. You have an election cycles in the U.S., so you got to find what to fill in between. But it was
yeah.
very interesting to see that contrasted with the advertising in Mexico, which was generally pretty stable. It declined 1% to 1.3 billion, but it grew 2% in local currency. Again, seeing growth on their streaming services. They said that they were seeing favorable scatter dynamics, but that was partially offset by lower local advertising.
Okay, and then obviously FIFA World Cup
Yeah.
rights for them upcoming, so they're looking at a pretty healthy 2026 between political and sports.
Yeah, exactly. They talked about that, how they should be benefiting from those events in 2026. So, yeah, I would expect to see relatively strong, results from them, especially with the World Cup.
Yeah. All right, let's round out with Mercado Libre. Since that's commerce, we'll tack on a bit of a conversation regarding tariffs to the back of that, and then we can talk about what we're looking forward to next week.
Yeah, so Mercado Libre continues that commerce growth we're seeing across other players as well, but obviously off a small base. When you're seeing players such as Amazon growing above 20%, that 67% advertising growth for Mercado Libre doesn't come as a surprise, especially as the region is underpenetrated in that particular space. In T1Y, we estimate total commerce revenue to be about 6.5% in 2025 out of the total LATAM's advertising revenue, with that share expected to grow to about 10% by 2030. And that kind of concurs with what management have been speaking about, where they're expecting AI to really potentially accelerate this shift from offline to online, and e-commerce penetration really growing over the next couple of years, and that really providing momentum for commerce advertising, especially for them. Now, it's interesting to see that they also have a fintech business. They're quite not just focused on just the retail media side, but also financials and like services, benefiting from those data capabilities as well. Having more data on consumers is always interesting and important, especially for advertisers. So that bit part of the business also showing healthy growth.
Yeah, I remember doing some analysis, gosh, I don't know, 4 or 5 years back on digital penetration across LATAM and banking penetration across LATAM, and both of those lagging other markets. So not surprising to see companies coming in and trying to, fill that gap for people. Okay, very interesting. I mean, big markets for them across Mexico and Brazil. I mean, Brazil is one of those that's been seeing a big rise in competition from some of those Asia-based retailers as well, like Temu and Shein. And I think was one of the markets I saw mentioned talking about reviewing their sort of customs exemptions in the US, what we've called the de minimis, exemption where low value goods could enter the country without the same kind of duties and payments as larger items. That was one of the other things besides tariffs that was changed in the US last year. And so that's, I think, what has contributed to a lot of advertising now targeting markets around the world, not just the US, but markets like Brazil and even Africa and Southeast Asia, Europe, as new sources of growth for these commerce players. And the question is, I mean, US tariffs now have been called into question, at least those that were using, I think it's the IEEPA. There's a lot of uncertainty still, right? This is the problem for advertisers who have the Supreme Court ruling, but very little clarity on whether that money gets returned or whether the administration uses other laws and ways of assigning tariffs. Still a lot of uncertainty. I think, again, we're going to see advertisers in the meantime continue to invest in growth. But the other thing I've been watching and reading is these, aside from tariffs, the customs exemptions, the de minimis, and the markets where they've seen a rise in some of these e-commerce players. And those markets are now looking at whether they also want to collect more duties or try to stop, in some cases, lots of cheap goods flowing into the country. So a little bit like whack-a-mole potentially in terms of where advertising revenue heads next, depending on all of these tariff conversations and customs conversations that are happening in markets. But really, really interesting in terms of how that maybe prefaces where we see advertising revenue growing and declining in the next couple of years. All right. Let's chat about what happens next. We are looking forward to a few more earnings. Who do we have on track for next week?
I think we got iHeart coming up next week, so that should provide a little bit more visibility on that side of the advertising world. And then there's a few more stragglers coming in over the next few weeks as well.
And then from Europe, we have ITV, Reach, and Ströer, as well as retailers such as Target, JD.com. So more useful reads on the commerce space and the media owner space.
Excellent. If anyone's looking for something else to listen to after this podcast, of course, I listened to a couple of interesting things this week. One was the interview of the Anthropic CEO, Dario Amodei, on the Dwarkesh podcast, talking about how close we are to superintelligence or human level intelligence. He has a concept he calls a country of geniuses in a data center. It's quite a lot of AI boosterism, but I think good to listen to, even for the insight into how these CEOs are considering their work and their goalposts, given that there are just a few of these current foundation model leaders. So worth having a listen to that. And the other thing was a big technology podcast from Alex Kantrowitz, which I highly, highly recommend most weeks. One of the interesting ones recently, he had author Michael Pollan on to discuss his new book on consciousness, not really into the whole psychedelics piece of that work, but the premise of this book is more about, can machines gain consciousness, what that would look like, the work going on currently in sort of academic and other circles exploring this and trying to determine, what it would take or how we would know that models or robots or whoever else are conscious and what that would mean for our interactions with them. One of his sort of ideas or premises was that they would have to have some kind of sense of their mortality. So either be able to feel pain or something like that that would make it more human. So worth a listen if you're interested in that kind of thing as well. Otherwise, we will be back with you and you can listen to us next week. So thanks for tuning in to the WPP Media Intelligence Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you have any questions for the show, you can email us at business.intelligence@wppmedia.com. The Media Intelligence Podcast from WPP Media is meant for informational and entertainment purposes only and should not be considered financial advice.